Hi, my name is Jake Greenspan. I'm the director of the Floor Time Center, and I'm also the son of Dr. Stanley Greenspan. Today we're going to talk about the Greenspan DIR model and the social emotional milestones that are necessary for a successful life. More and more research has been coming out about the importance of social emotional skills in everybody's lives, but especially at looking at long-term outcomes for children. In this lecture, you'll understand Dr. Greenspan's framework, the Greenspan DIR model, and the 6 primary developmental milestones that he highlighted throughout his career. It's these 6 developmental milestones that were the groundbreaking component of his DIR model and his general theory that said that all children, starting at birth, have emotions and emotional experiences and emotional systems. And it is these emotional experiences and the development of their emotional system that drives their ability to interact and understand the world around them, i.e. cognition. He felt that every experience we have has some sort of emotional impact on us, both positive and negative some of the time, and that these emotional perceptions of the world around us begin to wire our brain for future understanding of the world around us. We know in situations of trauma, abuse, and neglect that these types of emotional experiences will have long-term significant repercussions on the development of the brain and a person's personality. However, the same is true in less significant ways, but nonetheless true of more subtle emotional experiences. Every experience we have has an emotional and a sensory-based component to it that we perceive, understand, and respond to. A number of years ago, I read an article published by the World Economic Forum that highlighted a study being done at Princeton University in their Child Study Center that found that when looking at infants and some of the necessary skills or abilities that they develop within the first 3 years of life, for a while now, especially in the U.S., we've been pushing academics and more skill-based acquisition educational models, meaning getting kids to sit down, look at cards, play adult-led activities or games. And while these experiences have educational value, they actually are not working on the child's social-emotional skill set, and they are needing to come at the right time as opposed to being the primary focus. When I say they need to come at the right time, this means that later in life, when we're in school and academics are a priority, and we have the fundamentals for understanding the world around us already from our social emotional skill set, then more adult structured stationary activities are relevant. While many believe, including me, there's still better ways to learn, nonetheless, those traditional learning activities can still have value. However, early in life, it is now known that these activities should not take priority. And whether a child is in the range of 0 to 3, or whether they're 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and have developmental delays and are functioning in some ways as a younger child, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing a child's social emotional health as opposed to more academic, adult-led, traditional learning. What Princeton found is that the 2 most important things a child develop early in life are an interest in people and the ability to detect and remember patterns. Well, what does this mean? Well, an interest in people is fairly straightforward. We want a child to be interested in those around them, to build relationships, engage, and have the ability to develop empathy. We want a child to be interested in people so ultimately they can learn from them. The emotional gestures, the words, the actions that people provide are all learning experiences happening in a natural environment that children can and will pick up on if given the opportunity. But in doing that, as the explanation I just provided shows, many of the things a child may be observing are complicated and multifaceted. So the ability to detect and remember patterns is also of crucial importance. Unfortunately, some parents and professionals I've talked to think that means they should teach the child to say the alphabet, count numbers, and memorize other patterns. That is not actually how we develop the ability to detect and remember patterns. And the types of patterns that this study is identifying are not these static, fixed, memorized patterns, but instead the dynamic social patterns that are around us all the time. When I say dynamic, I mean changing and evolving patterns, not rigid, repetitive, memorized patterns. Now, certainly, familiar songs and activities can help us develop a framework for some of these patterns. However, if we primarily focus on memorized, fixed, rigid patterns, many children develop more concrete, rigid personalities, especially children with developmental delays. By definition, many children with developmental delays, like autism, already struggle with thinking conceptually and in an abstract manner. So coming up and creating their own patterns is very difficult for them, if not at certain points in their lives impossible. However, if we nurture a child's ability to develop their own patterns, to understand that there isn't always just one response, but many directions a pattern can go in, i.e. dynamic patterns, then we see that a child has the ability to create and detect and remember patterns altogether. And as you can tell from my explanation, one of the things that Princeton University found is the best way to stimulate these two developmental goals and interest in people in the ability to detect and remember patterns, and I will throw in create patterns as well. The best activity they found was high quality social interactions and play, meaning that from 0 to 3, or meaning the skills that we should develop from 0 to 3 at whatever age we're in are best achieved through high quality social interactions and play. Then that begs the question, why is it that at early ages in preschools and homes around the world, we're still seeing children being sat at tables, being given structured activities, being given instructions and specific outcomes of what we're trying to achieve, while maybe, if we're lucky, once in a while being provided opportunities to truly be creative and do open-ended tasks. All of the research to date shows that the majority of a child's time should be spent on more creative and social pursuits and less on adult-structured, rigid, specific outcome-based pursuits. More recently, a study from Duke University and Penn State University found that in a 13 to 19 year longitudinal outcome study, when they measured individuals and their social emotional skills by kindergarten and looked at them after 13 to 19 years, they found that the individuals with greater social emotional understanding and skill sets at the early age of kindergarten were more likely to achieve higher levels of education, attain and retain better employment, and show lower incidence of criminal activity, substance abuse, and mental health. Again, we see here that the social emotional skill set that a child develops in their first 3 or 5 or even 7 years of life is of crucial importance to their long-term outcomes. Again, this begs a very important question. Whether we have a child without developmental challenges who by age 5 hasn't mastered these skills, or whether we have a child with developmental challenges who by age 8 hasn't mastered these skills. How should we be prioritizing the child's time, and where should we be placing the focus of their educational and I would call social educational programs? This is even more relevant right now as we see so many children are out of school and at home and needing of more social opportunities, needing of more opportunities to boost their social emotional health. Well, the good news is that social emotional health isn't only achieved by playing with peers on the playground or at lunch. It actually begins and is often maintained by family relationships, caregivers especially, so that caregiver-child interactions are actually the #1 driving force for social emotional health and skills in all of us. The World Health Organization actually published a 50-page article aggregating all of the theories and evidence over the last 60 years, showing that child caregiver interactions are actually as important as food and shelter for a child's survivability. So then we need to ask ourselves, as we have more time together as a family, as both mom and dad, or however the family unit is organized, are all together, then what are we doing with this time? Are we using this time simply to read books and do activities? Or are we using this time to play, have fun, and relax, as children and caregivers should? It's not that we need to be ignoring some of the academic activities, but we should not be prioritizing them and letting the need to access them overwhelm us so that we are not then available to be interactive, playful, and work on the social emotional health of a child who may need it even now more than ever. Dr. Stanley Greenspan had 6 primary social emotional milestones that he highlighted in the majority of his books. The first of these milestones is shared attention. This is the ability to attend to a person and an activity or toy. This attention must be distributed, i.e. shared, with the majority being on the person, not the toy. A lot of people don't understand that attention, even later in life, academically, doing a worksheet, reading a book, paying attention to your teacher, is actually a socially developed skill. It is not something we develop by playing alone or reading a book by ourselves. Those actually have been proven to show poorer attention in the classroom. But instead, children are able to attend to people, develop stronger attentional skills, meaning the children who are able to interact and sustain their shared attention with another person within an activity for longer periods of time typically develop stronger attentional capacities later in life. So, again, if we want a child to learn how to attend in a classroom, should we be forcing them to sit down and do worksheets and listen to directions? Or should we be focusing on social interactive play that nurtures their interest in people as well as their ability to understand patterns and attend to those people and patterns? The second milestone Dr. Greenspan talked a lot about was engagement. This is our emotional connection between a child and caregiver, or a child and adult, or child and peer. A lot of people associate this with eye contact. Unfortunately, if we only look for a specific symptom of these broader milestones or capacities like engagement, we can actually have a negative impact on the child. How many of us sit at coffee or at dinner with another person and stare at them in the eyes the whole time? Well, of course we don't, because it's creepy and weird, and it's not actually how the brain and body work. We reference people, we look at them, we're looking for feedback, we're looking at them as we're conveying an idea. We don't look at people all the time. That is why we cannot associate eye contact and sustained eye contact as an applicable goal. Yes, many children with poor eye contact or gaze aversion need to improve that. But again, is the goal here to improve eye contact, or is the goal to improve engagement? I used to be a classroom teacher for children with many different types of learning challenges. And some of the children in my class truly struggled at looking and listening at the same time. That in itself is a description of what we call sensory integration problems, not eye contact issues. And unfortunately, before I had the knowledge I have now, in the classroom, I would sometimes request all eyes up front, eyes on me, things like that typical to a classroom. But what I was actually doing for some of the students, not all, but some of the students, was making it more difficult for them to pay attention. Why? Because they were able to listen but not look at me and actually absorb more information and even write notes, as opposed to looking at me and listening at the same time, which was much more difficult for them. One girl in particular would actually have to doodle and almost disconnect some of her visual system from what was going on in the front of the room and focus on something right in front of her that she was in control of in order to listen to the lesson. And she and I would have many conversations about it because it was actually unnerving to me to watch her not visually connecting and paying attention and seemingly disengaged. But in reality, her lack of eye contact was not a symptom of lack of engagement. This is very important to understand as children perform. That being said, there are plenty of children out there who do get visually focused on activity and are completely ignoring you. So this goes both ways. Please understand each child is unique and different. And the third milestone, two-way purposeful interaction communication, the opening and closing of circles. This is the reciprocal, pre-verbal, free-flowing, non-adult directed interactions that are first established between child and caregiver. This is one of the most crucial skill sets a child develops within the first 9 months of life. Their ability to get into very simple gestural back and forth with their caregiver allows them to begin to understand turn taking, reciprocity, even the beginning of limits and expectations. It was actually found in an early study by Dr. Greenspan that at 4 months, a child should be consistently responsive to their parent's emotional overture. Meaning, if a child was sitting on their lap facing away from them, and the parent made a loud, enthusiastic, exciting sound like, "Oh boy, what's that?" If the child turns and looks at them because they heard what they said, they felt the emotion behind it, and that drove them to use their motor system to turn their head and then connect with the caregiver visually and potentially auditorily, now we have a response pattern. But Dr. Greenspan found that if by 4 months that's not happening consistently, that a child has an 80% likelihood of developing some sort of developmental or learning issues later in life. But again, how often when we have a child who doesn't consistently respond to us, a child who's very distracted, hyper, fragmented, again, how often are we focusing on getting them into these consistent response patterns with us in a playful, meaningful, and voluntary manner versus forcing them to work on a specific symptom like sitting down? The fourth milestone Dr. Greenspan talked about, which is actually the most important of all of them, as he often described it, is social problem solving and a continuous flow of interaction. This is the continuous interactive social pattern that uses many combined gestures for communication. These gestures can include things like pointing, grabbing, smiling, shaking, but also frowning, nodding, any type of body movement that might be purposeful and used in a social format, i.e. communication. What he found was that the elongated interactive pattern that involved many steps of these reciprocal exchanges, of a smile for a smile, a frown for a frown, pointing and grabbing and handing and taking, each of these exchanges being put into a long pattern are what this continuous flow is. And in doing that, we're ultimately being challenged and face different problems. So we have to learn how to become creative problem solvers and learn to be adaptable with our solution set. This means that if we point to something and someone doesn't get it for us, we go over to them, we tap them on the leg, and then we point again. If they still don't get it for us and they grab the wrong toy, we shake our head and we get closer to the shelf and we point again. Now you can see I've added in 2 or 3 extra communicative gestures in order to achieve my goal versus what many children do, which is just continue to point and point and point and sometimes escalate and whine or tantrum, or give up and avoid. Both of those are maladaptive and immature forms of communication. However, if we have the ability to be dynamic and combine many of these steps of gestures used for social problem solving and communication, we see that children are able to stay within interactions for longer, tolerate challenges because they have adaptable and creative problem solving abilities, and they're more able to tolerate stress in larger and larger quantities because what do good problem solvers do? They come up with new solutions and different solutions. They don't give up or get frustrated very easily. Now, as we're developing this ability for longer, continuous social exchanges and communicative patterns, we are actually wiring, in many parts, the right side of our brain, which is our motor system, because we're using our body and our faces to communicate. And as our motor system develops and is affiliated and associated and connected to communication, as development occurs, we then move over to the left side of our brain, which is where language and symbolism exist. And we move into the fifth milestone, which is meaningful symbolic ideation and communication. This is the ability to create meaningful symbols to express oneself. The use of language or other symbols to express meaningful ideas in reality and in pretend play. The word meaningful is used here 3 times on the screen, and I've said it an equal number of times because Children who learn to label and memorize with vocabulary words are not meaningfully communicating, and these are not meaningful ideas to them, they're someone else's ideas. What we're talking about is if a child says chair, not because they see one and are just pointing it out, but because they want to sit down, now that chair is meaningful to them. If we use language in non-meaningful formats, if we learn language in an unemotionally driven, non-contextual, and non-meaningful way, then unfortunately our language use will not be for communication purposes. This is often why children who are receiving many forms of traditional speech and language therapy unfortunately will learn thousands of vocabulary words, but only use 50 to 100 of them consistently because those are the only ones that have had any meaning to them. Unfortunately, part of it is the learning process through which the child is developing that language that is leading to a non-meaningful understanding of words. It's no different than someone telling you to count to 100, but have no idea that each of those numbers represents a quantity, that you can have $100 or 100 people or 100 chairs. That is the meaning behind it. It has to have some connection to us personally or in our lives in order to understand the concepts behind it versus just memorizing the words or numbers. And finally, the sixth milestone, building logical bridges between ideas and abstract thinking. Once we can express one idea, like I want a cookie, or come here, or help me, or mommy, daddy, then we can start to connect two ideas by sometimes answering W questions like who, what, when, where, why, and sometimes just connecting the ideas naturally on our own. I want mommy. Well, what do you want to do with mommy? I want a hug. Oh, well, now we're connecting two ideas in association with mom and a hug. Or we could just say, I want to hug mommy, and we've naturally connected those two ideas. This is also where our opinions start developing. Children start referencing things they like and don't like, things they enjoy, things that make them happy or sad or scared or frustrated, i.e., we start seeing a broader emotional range emerge and a broader awareness on abstract ideas like emotions. So even heightened levels of empathy and social awareness come at this milestone. As you can see here on this slide, we've taken Dr. Greenspan's developmental milestones and compared them to many of the skills and abilities that the CDC highlights in one of their handouts, where they talk about social emotional skills as well as others. I've taken much of the information from their handout and combined it here and tried to find many of the right age matchings. You'll see later on, and even with some of the earlier stages, that these ages are estimates. They are not exact. Do not freak out that if by 9 months your child is not doing this. However, if by 3 or 4 months after 9 months they're still not doing these things, you should be aware that these things need to be worked on. So if you have a 12-month-old who isn't emotionally connected, isn't consistently responding, isn't initiating with caregivers, we now have a problem. However, if we have a 12-month-old who is doing those things, let's keep moving forward. But look at what the CDC identifies. Things like smiling spontaneously, especially at people, copying movements and facial expressions like smiling and frowning from those around them. Again, what do those require? If we're going to copy movements and facial expressions of other people, well, we have to be engaged. Engagement is the second milestone. Engagement allows us to be emotionally connected with people. When we copy people, it's not because we're being told or forced to do it. We're doing it because we're interested in them and what they're doing. And as a result, we mimic them and copy them. What is the old saying? Mimicry is the ultimate form of flattery. Well, yes, that is actually true, because what are we trying to mimic? The things we appreciate, the things we're interested in, the things we idealize. So a caregiver being copied by their infant is a sign that the child is emotionally connected with you. However, when we turn copying into work and we force a child to do that, we're getting rid of the emotional component. We're not guaranteeing engagement. And unfortunately, now we have a child who thinks that copying is the goal, not the emotional connection. We also see many other skills, such as knowing familiar and non-familiar faces, enjoying playing with others, especially with parents and other caregivers, responding to other people's emotions, and enjoying looking at yourself in the mirror. These are all things that most infants do. But if for some reason an infant isn't doing it, or if your older child isn't doing it, remember, children with developmental delays are going to develop these skills at a slightly later date. But we still have to help them develop these, not by force, but by enticement. So if we have a child who is 2, 3, 4 years old who are not doing these things, it is important we go back and solidify these things, fill in the holes. Otherwise, it will be very hard to move forward academically and socially and be successful later in life. Now, around 18 months of life, a child should be moving into and developing decent mastery over the fourth milestone in the Greenspan DIR model. This is the social problem-solving continuous flow of interaction. This is where children use many steps of dynamic physical communication to solve problems socially and meet their needs, meaning taking an adult by their hand, putting on the doorknob, looking at the adult, pointing, shaking their head, maybe grabbing a different adult who's more willing to open the door for them, etc. It's these long, expansive patterns of social interaction, often being used to solve a social problem. Remember, dragging a chair to a shelf to get a toy in isolation is not social problem solving. But what do we see the CDC has here? We see they also have certain types of social interactions that need to be developing by age 18 months. Playing games such as peekaboo, chase, simple hide and seek, treasure hunt games with toys. Using sounds or actions to get attention, meaning they're initiating, i.e., that is problem solving to get attention, and they're using sounds, which can be preverbal communication. They actually want to be participating with others. They hand things to others. They want to play with them. They show higher levels of affection for familiar people. They begin starting to do some simple pretend play, very simple, that usually replicates things from real life. Feeding a doll, putting them to sleep, maybe changing the diaper, etc. And they're often more likely to go off and explore, but like the parent to be close by. Again, each of these things we see that a child is progressing, becoming more emotionally connected, more socially interested, and being able to get into more complex and expansive social interactions. Remember, if your child by age 2.5, 3, or 4 isn't doing these things, think of the CDC list as a checklist. If they're not doing this, then we need to go back and work on these things. Now, between 2 to 2.5, typically, children start developing the ability for symbolic ideation, i.e. the use of language to communicate. This is the fifth milestone in the Greenspan DIR model, the meaningful and symbolic use of ideas in communication. This is where children begin to meaningfully express their wants and needs, not repeating or scripting or being prompted, but spontaneous and meaningful communication. They begin generating, expressing ideas in pretend that are abstract, like flying a car to the moon, as well as using examples from real life. And they begin expressing emotions and opinions like I like it, it's fun, etc. And they're also able to use other forms of symbolic communication, maybe drawing pictures to represent certain experiences or feelings or ideas, as well as utilizing play-based tools like action figures and cars. What does the CDC say? They are saying that at this age, children are copying others, especially adults and older children, who are a little bit more easy to understand than other peers their age. They get excited when around other children, but again, not always able to fully interact and engage with them by this age. They start to show more independence, and while they're interested in other kids and able to play parallel with them with toys, they're more able to interact socially with other children around physical activities, such as chase games. There's a reason why during the same time when a child is developing their abilities to play with symbolic toys like action figures and cars and stuffed animals, that they can't quite transfer that over to peers yet. This is because when we are developing a skill, rarely can we use it in the most challenging environments. Unfortunately, peers are often unpredictable and even less enticing and supportive than caregivers and other adults. So, for me to take a new skill I'm just learning and using it in a less supportive environment is even more challenging. So, children will often learn to do the pretend play with a caregiver first and then learn to do it with peers. And just like we were seeing in previous slides, they have already been playing physically and interactively with their caregivers by playing tickle and chase and peekaboo, etc. And now, by around 2 to 2.5, they can do some of the physical play with peers, but not the symbolic play yet because they're still developing that and strengthening it. But again, remember, if we have a 3, 4, or 5-year-old who we can't check off these boxes with, should we be moving forward and prioritizing academics? Or should we be spending the majority, 60, 70, 80% of their time, that means, the majority, remember, is greater than 50%, should we be spending that time on social emotional skill development? The answer, from what the research says and what from Dr. Greenspan said and from what we see clinically at the Floortime Center, is absolutely. If we go back and focus on the fundamental, basic components of social interaction, emotional connection, adaptable interactive patterns, then we see that children are more able to do all of the things that come later in life. However, if we interrupt this process by trying to do 50-50, where half the time is spent on learning the alphabet and to sight read words, and the other 50% is spent doing this, where there is a deficit in the social emotional, unfortunately, we don't always catch up on the social emotional components, leading to less positive outcomes later in life. And the 6th milestone in Dr. Greenspan's model is building logical bridges between ideas. Now, around 3 to 3.5, we see that children should be developing this. This is their ability to answer opinion-based who, what, where questions. Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Etc. Eventually, they get to the why and the how questions, which are more complicated, and they start expressing opinions spontaneously. I like that. That was fun. That was scary, etc. What does the CDC say? Well, this is where children actually, again, expand their emotional range, their ability to connect. You see, they show more affection for their friends without prompting. They take turns because they're understanding the reciprocal nature of interactions and exchange. And they also understand that to have fun means sometimes taking turns and sharing because we value the social component of the activity, not just because we're supposed to take turns and share. A child is more likely to show concern for a crying friend. They understand the idea of mine, but also someone else's. They show a wider range of emotions, enjoy doing new things, and they become more and more creative with their make-believe pretend play. They cooperate with other children, and they talk about their likes and what they're interested in. Again, this is the ability to express emotions, have opinions, become more flexible, dynamic, and creative, have more complex social exchanges with a more complex system of logic of understanding cause and effect. If I do this, then that happens. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's here, we're now at the 6th milestone. We have the CDC skills that a child should have by age 3.5. And we see that many children, those with a diagnosis of developmental challenge like autism or something else, and even a child without a diagnosis who might have some more mild behavioral, social, or learning difficulties, or possibly having no symptoms other than a lack of some of these abilities. It is these types of skills, milestones, and capacities that we need to nurture and develop in a child in order to help them become a successful adult. It is these big picture capacities that Dr. Greenspan talks about. Remember, his milestones are the big picture. He doesn't get bogged down by looking at every symptom in detail because he knows every child is different. Just because one child is not pointing but they're communicating doesn't mean they have a massive problem. if a child uses their whole hand to point to something, some doctors will actually say he's not pointing, and they check off a box on the autism checklist. However, the child was clearly gesturally communicating with their hand. They just weren't able to differentiate one finger from the rest. Will you tell me, is that a fair assessment of the child's abilities if the doctor's only looking specifically at one outcome that they're trying to check off on a list? Well, no, that is actually fairly irrelevant. So if a child is trying to communicate gesturally, if they're motioning with their hand towards an object, yes, we want them to begin to learn to use their finger to point, but they're still pointing, just not in the way that we have been taught pointing is defined. That shouldn't matter. Remember, we need to focus on the big picture milestones and capacities and not get bogged down in every little detail. Because if we try to address every little detail, which is what many approaches in academic programs will try to do, unfortunately the list is infinite. There is an infinite number of small skills that every child needs to develop, and if they're not developing these skills on their own, then we're going to be stuck with teaching them. But what if we go back to some of those first slides and say, hey, the key to a child learning is their ability to engage with people, connect with people, being interested in people, as well as understanding the social patterns that are around them. If they can do those two things, and we nurture their ability to do those things, then the world is their oyster. However, if we focus on every little skill, if we focus and decide that our only avenue for helping a child succeed is to teach them through adult-led structured activities, then unfortunately we're going to get what we put in. We're going to get a rigid, limited child. However, if we help a child focus on the big picture, like we were hopefully given the opportunity to do, then we see the outcomes can be robust and comprehensive, and the research that supports the idea of a child achieving higher levels of education, better employment, as well as lower frequencies of criminal activity, substance abuse, and especially lower incidence of mental health issues, then we see the real importance of all of this. I hope this lecture was informative, and during this period of spending so much time together, that we're able to implement some of these strategies and understand what the main goal should be for most children. We need to take this time as an opportunity to boost a child's social-emotional health, not simply try to find new avenues to focus on academics. Yes, we don't want to lose some of the academic gains that children have made over this past year, but we also need to understand that the world is changing, that the world is going to be an increasingly challenging and stressful place, so we're going to need higher levels of emotional fortitude in order to navigate it. And the children who are now going to be focusing on their social emotional health, not just academic, will be the ones who succeed in 10, 15, 20 years. The children who are not being given opportunities to nurture and develop their social emotional health, and again, I'm talking about with caregivers, not with peers, then these children are unfortunately not going to fare as well. For more information and lectures and training, please go to Dr. Stanley Greenspan's website for the Greenspan Floor Time Approach, stanleygreenspan.com. And if you're looking for support, coaching, both in person and online, as well as intensive therapy programs and services, please contact me at the Floor Time Center. Thank you very much.